Morning, morning, everyone. Nice to see some of you logging on now. Please do introduce yourself on the chat. Just tell us who you are and where you're ringing in from. We're delighted to have you with us. We'll just let a few more people in, and then we'll introduce you to our wonderful conversationalists. And I hope you have a nice cup of coffee in your hands to enjoy as we start the day. Wonderful. Okay. Just a little bit longer and then we'll be good to go. Okay, so everybody, thank you so much for joining us. It's lovely to have you with us. This is our third session that B Europe have been organising in our Coffee in Good Company series. And this is an opportunity we have, and we are really keen to share with all those who are interested in understanding more about what stakeholder governance really means and what stakeholder management of a company really means. We're hearing so many words around this. It's a phrase that's now cropping up in everyday language, in many articles, far more than ever used to be the case. And it sounds great, but it's a little bit of a mystery as to what it really can mean. And this is really important because I think right now we're all struggling with what are the future, what is the role of business in the future? What can we do to ensure that business is serving the society and the environment in which it operates and not drawing and extracting from it? And for those of you who are following this in the European Union, you may well be aware that the European Commission has actually launched a consultation on exactly this topic about what should sustainable corporate governance really look like. And so our answer to that is it should look much like we think the B Corps do, which is to embed a legal commitment to consider the interests of all their stakeholders in the running and the governance of the company. And that's really where we're at. We have this wonderful opportunity, we think, to show how companies can make a real difference and contribute to society if they operate in that way. So these series of coffee companies are leading up to our coalition we're creating, Interdependence Coalition, in order to make the case that this is the way European businesses could go. And who better to discuss this with than our wonderful Professor Jaap Winter, who has really made a career out of looking at company law and what that could mean and how companies can really be contributory to society and environment. So I'm going to introduce you to Jaap. I'm also here with my wonderful colleague, Wojciech Baginski, who is also a lawyer, also an expert in corporate law, and is with us in the B Lab team in Poland. So he's part of Team Poland and has been very much shaping the thinking for us in this world. So I'm delighted that we can have this coffee company together. Please do, as you listen and hear really interesting debate about this conversation, please do put questions or comments in the chat. If we have time, we will try and get to them. I can't promise we will because we've got a lot of material, but we can then come back to you afterwards if we haven't managed to cover everything in this conversation. So great. So with that introduction, I'd like to start by asking Jaap what you feel. Jaap, this is a really kind of extraordinary opportunity. We're in such a funny moment with an extraordinary moment where we're really looking at what it is that is the future of our governance in companies. And you've made your life career in this area. And we see this opportunity to move to a stakeholder governance shift for the economy. What do you see? Are you feeling this opportunity is unique? Have you been here before? Do you see this as something really special?
Well, thank you very much, Katie, and delighted to be here this morning with all of you to discuss this topic. I think it's of crucial importance. And to answer directly to your last question, I think this is a unique situation that we find ourselves in terms of governance questions, but also in where we are in the world. Last night I saw another documentary about our planetary boundaries, and it is so disturbing what we see. It is so disturbing what we see, how far we've pushed the limits of our planetary habitat in terms of climate, biodiversity, pollution, soil degradation, all the things that we know from a distance perhaps, there is a need to really change this fundamentally. And I think this relates back to our human nature, where if you read the wonderful books of Jared Diamond, we've built societies that exhaust our environments consistently and then move to another place. The problem now is we are exhausting the whole earth. There is no other place. We have to stop exhausting the earth in the way that we do with fossil fuels, but also in the way we conduct our agriculture, the way we produce waste and let it linger throughout the world in our oceans and seas. And there is no time anymore to see this just as a non-committal hobby for those who want to do it. We need to contribute, all of us, both us individuals as consumers in the way that we conduct ourselves, but certainly also business in the way that they respond to these challenges. This is not, and that is unique, I think. We've never been here before. And it requires a different attitude, a completely different mindset than we've ever thought of. I think in the business community, and not strangely, in the same way as us as consumers, we've always thought, well, this is a general interest type of concern and we need governments to solve this. Meanwhile, I can do whatever is best for me to continue doing. And I think that should stop. In the business context, that has come from this notion that Milton Friedman started, that the societal purpose of business is to make profits for their shareholders. And I think that has created a disconnect between business and society, business and planet. Like the concerns in society and planet are not our concerns until the government tells us to stop something or to do something. Until that moment, this is not our concern. And I think that notion is changing, is fundamentally changing, and the efforts of the European Union are very clearly in the direction to fundamentally change it. And it has to change. There is no way of not changing it at this moment. That's how I deeply feel at this moment. So it's unique where we are. We need to change.
Yeah, I know, Wojciech, this is something you felt very much, isn't it?
Yes. Thanks also for having me here. It's I feel it's a very important discussions that we're having within the EU. And as a lawyer, it's amazing to be able to look at this with a lens and think about these issues. I think I would like to. I just have one question, because like lawyer to lawyer discussion. Do you think that the way the EU is heading, and with all the innovative changes to corporate law that it's proposing, is there a possibility to align member states on this ambitious goal? Are we heading the right way, and are we able to achieve this? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure it's a question from lawyer to lawyer. It's much more a political question whether member states want to align themselves. My experience that I've been working with the European Union in harmonizing corporate law over the last 20 years or so, this is a tough challenge for member states to start to agree on. Some member states will feel deeply concerned and want to move, others will not. They feel that some of their industry is at risk when we move this. They will start to resist, or their particular concept of their corporate governance model is at risk. So we don't want this. Let us sort it out for ourselves, how to do this. Harmonizing this at EU level is a struggle. I think the Commission has been very courageous in putting forward, we are going to do this. The intention of the Commission is to come up with a sustainable corporate governance initiative in this summer. They've initially said June. I think it's going to be a bit later. They will address particularly, and I think very relevantly so, the duty of care of directors, to extend that explicitly to concerns outside your direct realm in terms of ecological concerns, societal concerns that are impacted by your governance or your corporate behavior, your corporate conduct. I think that's courageous, but I already see the resistance mounting in some member states against the European Union initiative there. What is strange, and this is also always part of the European dimension, I am very much engaged in the discussion in my country, the Netherlands, on how to move this forward, and I've come up with a proposal to extend the duty of directors to explicitly include these concerns. And one of the first responses that business then gives, no, we should not regulate this at Dutch level, we should do this at EU level. And then at EU level, we start to disagree on how to do this, so nobody has to do anything. And that is where I say, oh, stop. This is, if you're going to play this game, I'm not in. That's not my game. We should do something. we should do something now. This is not for, it would be great if we have something in 5 years' time. We need it now, actually. And that's much, it's not a, actually, it's not a legal discussion. That is a political discussion. Do we want to move? And do we want to take away the non-committal attitude of business? Do we no longer allow business to be non-committal in this sense? Some will commit. There are great companies who've making great strides in doing this, absolutely, no doubt. But many do not, or only hesitantly, or a little bit. And when there is a pushback, we don't do it. And my sense is we can no longer afford business to take that attitude. We have to act now.
So, okay, so if I was thinking about the legal side of this discussion, in a sense that one of the ideas from the EU is to revise the duty of care, generally include stakeholders in the decision-making processes of the boards of directors. And that would mean that the EU would like to make a shift in the company laws of each member state. So do you feel that the opposition towards this is coming from lawyers who are saying this is a fundamental rule and let's not play with this without sufficient research? What do you think about this?
Well, there is certainly strong hesitation from numbers of lawyers who are very conservative in wanting in allowing to any fundamental change in the concept of corporate law. But the funny thing is, and the strange thing is, this notion of companies are there to serve the interests of their shareholders primarily is not a notion that has been there for hundreds of years. That was introduced in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. If you read the legal literature, and I've read quite some bit about it, the first years when we started to say that shareholder primacy is the core notion in corporate law are from the end of the 1990s. That is just over 20 years ago. This is not, if we push back on this, it is not fundamentally changing corporate law from its historic groundings. It's actually going back to where it was. If you look at interviews of American CEOs, Robert Reich wrote this in a beautiful book, Super Capitalism. Interviews with American CEOs from the 1950s, they said they felt their duty was to a broad range of stakeholders, not just shareholders. That's 1950s. So we're not pushing back against something that is fundamentally ingrained in corporate law since the last 400 years or so. It is striking a new balance. And I think even in countries where the stakeholder approach has been dominant for a long time, like the Netherlands, my own country, the shareholder dominance within that stakeholder approach has been very clear over the last 2-3 decades. And that is what we need to revise. And it's not fundamental, it's a change, and we have to make it explicit, because if we do not make it explicit, the current practices can continue without any change.
And what do you think? Because there's a lot of misconceptions around the changes that are being proposed. In a sense, for instance, people are bringing up the argument that changes to the fiduciary duties of directors will involve increased liability for the company, for the directors. This is one of the arguments. Do you think these are valid arguments, or we're being too careful in what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, well, clearly that argument is being put forward, and it is something for lawyers in the technique very much to take care of. The first thing to note is that the duty that a director owes is owed to the company. It is not owed to an anonymous group of external stakeholders directly who can directly sue for damages if you do not fulfill your duty. It's a duty towards the company. The company can sue. In practice, we hardly ever see litigation by companies against their own directors or former directors for damages because they have breached their duties. It happens every now and then, hardly ever. So the actual risk is minimal. Secondly, in every jurisdiction, in every set of company law, when duties of directors are being discussed, there is a fundamental acceptance that directors need a certain discretion for decision making. Only when they go beyond the boundaries of that discretion, when the court comes to the view, no reasonable director would take this decision under these circumstances. Only when that threshold is met, liability could pursue towards the company. So, and I think that is correct, because what we need is responsible business people, women and men, who take decisions, taking all this to account, knowing that these are tough. It is not easy. You get strange dilemmas, strange trade-offs, where for the first time you need to consider how to do this. You are bound to make mistakes there. Your decision or your judgment about what is acceptable might be very different if you look 2 years later, look back at your decision. We took the wrong decision. None of that immediately should lead to liability. If you were, on the basis of the reasonable information that you had and could have at the moment of your decision making, could take this decision, you should be okay. Mm-hmm. Only when you completely disregard looking at other types of interest, when there is clearly avoidable harm and you nonetheless impose the harm on others, that is the type of situation where liability could ensue, and I believe rightly so. That is the sort of behavior we should no longer accept. And there are examples of those behaviors. There are companies polluting their environment for the last 30 years, knowing that it has a strongly detrimental effect on the health of people living in the surroundings of it. Knowingly continuing with that type of pollution. If that leads to personal liability of directors, I'm not so much against that, I would say. I think that is the right sort of measure to take.
Yes, and nobody should be, right. Nobody should be advocating against this, but unfortunately, those misconceptions and the legal arguments behind, I think they're creating a bit of a blur, and that's the problem. And because when I'm thinking about this shift in the fiduciary duty, I'm thinking also that if we achieve this, we're going to have a system whereby we signal strongly to the boards that they should consider stakeholders in their decision-making processes. And what that would mean is that we're not saying that they should balance, the interests always in favor of the stakeholders. We're saying, please, guys, sit down in the boardroom and have a look at the whole situation. Take a look at the impact of your decision on the different stakeholders. So we're not advocating for, prioritizing stakeholders over shareholders, which is the argument that comes up in these discussions, saying suddenly companies will be taking, thinking about stakeholders, but will forget about shareholders. But that's not the essence of this. Do you agree with this?
No, absolutely. And one way to look at it, and I think many people have said that, is that companies in their business efforts, they use various types of capital: financial capital, human capital, societal capital, natural capital. They should reward every form of capital that they are using to produce their product or services, including financial capital. It is in the nature of business to have to reward those who invest in your corporation and take the risk of possibly being successful, but also losing the money if the venture is not successful. Financial reward is part of your duty as directors, but it should no longer be the sole duty or the sole point of direction. You should balance these, and it should not be automatically the outcome that the shareholder interest by definition prevails. Sometimes they should prevail. Yes, they should prevail sometimes, but not always and not by definition. And we need business leaders who are able to make those judgments. If you then look at what is required in the boardroom to do this, from my own experience sitting in boardrooms and advising boards, also being a board member myself, I can see that you need a very different type of information to make that judgment calls. It is not just on the financial outcomes of your decisions about your EBITDAs and the profitability that an investment would take and the returns on equity that you would yield by doing something or not doing something. It is also having information, core information about the impact on society, on ecological decisions. That type of information is hardly available to the boardroom today. We need to fundamentally change that. And that, I think, is the real revolution that we need, to start to dig up information that is robust, that is not just arbitrary, but that is really robust, that you get a much better understanding of what the impact of your business conduct is in society, and that you are able to deal with that information in a responsible way. That's the fundamental change that we're looking for.
And actually, I was just going to add on to that. I mean, what I think is so interesting is this is the moment really to bring the experts, the expertise that people have gathered through whatever means together and share best practice and learning. And that's something we're really hoping that this initiative has sparked. And, you know, a good shout out to the European Commission for boldly going to that area, but we mustn't let that opportunity go. And obviously with the B Corps who've all committed to this stakeholder governance, there's a huge wealth of practice. Some has worked, some is learning. We had a lovely conversation last week with Beth Thorham from Patagonia, and she said exactly this. It's a really difficult balancing act, but it's one that you learned, you know, you build the muscles and you learn the role.
And one other element, Katie, if I may, is that if you think from this perspective, actually actively engaging with your stakeholders becomes crucial. Yeah. And not just the stakeholders who are directly involved in your corporation, like your staff, perhaps your creditors, your banks, etc., who are direct stakeholders financially or because of their work, but those who represent elements of society that are impacted by your business conduct or ecological aspects of the way that you run your business. To engage actively with them in a stakeholder dialogue will help you to figure out what their interests and concerns really are and how to include them in your own decision making. Yet there is much more information that you can have by actually talking to your stakeholders, not just imagining what would be in their interest, but finding out by engaging with them. In a dialogue, you can make that closer to you by bringing in people consistently in a sort of structured way, like in a sort of responsible business advisory council in your corporation, whatever you would call it, societal council. Some companies can venture, and that is very close to the benefit corporation movement, obviously, to bring stakeholders directly into your governance as co-decision makers. That would work for some companies, maybe not for all companies, but for some companies that would definitely work. So there are ways to get much more rich and detailed information about how to balance those interests by including the stakeholders in your own decision making, by figuring out, by listening to them, by not just supposing and imagining what they will think and say, but asking them about this. I think that is a crucial next step in stakeholder governance as well.
It's not rocket science, is it, to ask people, but it feels a new element. Please do put in the chat, any of you who have thoughts on this or experience, do share with others what you're doing at all to engage your stakeholders, if that's something you have thoughts about. I was just going to ask a little bit about what are the kind of options. We're at this stage where the Commission have put out a bold proposal or consultation. They're now going to create a proposal because we know that there's going to be quite a lot of debate going on about how this may affect competitiveness of Europe. What do you think are the options that we've got? At B-Lab, we're arguing we should have mandatory, obligatory stakeholder governance should be the default mechanism for all European companies. And what do you think are the other options that could be made available and could be powerful enough to create the real change that we're talking about?
Well, it's quite a challenge to think of alternatives that are really committal and not non-committal. The obvious example or the obvious alternative that's being put forward is by including something of this nature in corporate governance codes, like sort of the ambition or aspiration of how to conduct your business, include that in a corporate governance code. There are two problems with that. One is that a corporate governance code typically in Europe only applies to listed companies, to the largest segments of our business entities, and not to vast areas of our business who are simply not listed, are privately held, family owned, or in whatever shape or form. Codes do typically not apply to them, so you lose them. And secondly, codes are enforced on a basis of comply or explain. You either comply or you explain what you do differently, and that leaves an enormous area for discretion to actually say that you comply but not really do it, or just write down, and lawyers and accountants are very good in writing down that you actually comply, but in the business practice, you can't see it. It's not visible. So that mechanism is not strong enough, I believe, to deal with the urgency of our problems in society and in our planet. If that is a route that business wants to take in order to avoid litigation about personal liability, etc., that could only, for me, be discussed when there is a robust system of monitoring whether companies actually do this, whether they do, whether they live up to their own obligations or their own promises. We say that we do this, but do they actually do this? Also including comparing companies with each other in their sectors. For example, you are lagging behind you or you are a front runner. That type of information we should have, maybe including a ranking, and a much more robust ranking than the Dow Jones Sustainability Ranking, which is it's not a bad thing. It's a great thing to have, but it's also very much based on the information that is published, not so much on the actual conduct of business. So we have to imagine a system that is robust in understanding whether business is moving in this direction, fulfilling its own promises. If that is not existent, then I believe a corporate governance route leaves too much to non-committal, lovely words, greenwashing, whatever you call it very negatively, but not the real thing that we need today. I think, Wojciech, maybe you want to say something about another option, the opt-out option that you've been thinking about.
Yes, thank you. I've been thinking about this in a sense of in a sense of the duty of care, the fiduciary duties, since there is a strong opposition towards this idea in a sense of having a pan-European revision of the fiduciary duty. And one of the arguments that come up is also that why do we need to have a mandatory rule if actually the corporate governance codes in the commercial companies codes in Europe actually allow the boards to include stakeholder interests. So my thoughts go to towards an opt-out system. So if there's opposition towards mandatory change, let's maybe have a system whereby whereby companies would need to abide by this revised fiduciary duty, but there would be a possibility to opt out. So if you're afraid of liability, if you're afraid of different consequences that in your mind are unforeseen at this moment, you could actually, in the commercial companies register, you could tick the box that I prefer to have it a discretionary inclusion of stakeholder interest and not a mandatory one. I'm thinking, let's see how many companies would decide to actually tick the box and say that we prefer to have a system whereby in some cases we would be able to say that we won't be including stakeholder interests in our decisions.
Interesting. I know we're running very close to the line now, and I'm really sorry. Now, I knew one half an hour conversation time wouldn't be enough to cover all the huge number of things that we would love to open up. But I think, and I hope for everybody who's on the call, it's just given you a flavor of the legal aspects that are so crucial for us making headway. We will never ever make headway if we don't really grasp the legal and the fiduciary obligations that are assumed, and we try to break some of the myths as well that are underneath that, which we've heard, and you've done so beautifully. I don't think the EU Green Deal has a chance of working unless we crack this corporate code or corporate governance structures. We won't be able to actually meet our targets because, as we know, there are too many companies who will not abide by the rules that benefit everybody. So it feels an important agenda for the EU as well. And we know in London, our friends in London are also working very hard to try and change the Company Act across the UK. And there's a lot of work going on in the US. There's a very great paper that was written in coalition around stakeholder primacy shareholder primacy being replaced by stakeholder governance. So this isn't just the EU, and I think if there is this momentum, it may help the EU to be all the braver. But just to wind up and to thank you so much for this conversation, for your time and for all your thoughts. I know we'll be back in touch with all that we're doing. And the one thing I just wanted to leave everybody with is that we'll be actually launching this Interdependence Coalition, which is going to be launched on the 30th of June. So we'll be sending you all details, and we hope you'll bring your colleagues, friends, family along, just to get a feeling of this sort of collaborative effort to seize the moment and put the pressure on the European Commission and the member states to be bold and change the rules of the game for the benefit of everyone. So I hope you'll be with us on that. Again, thank you. I hope you've started your morning well. It's been wonderful, and really appreciate you all being here. Thank you again, Jaap. Thank you, Wojciech, and for everybody who's on the line with us.
Pleasure.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.